So in our class today, I did a demo of basic compositing and how you might drag in a bunch of different images and begin to use basic techniques to blend them together. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. We have this image of a grassy field with this path kind of going off into the distance. And I'm just going to use this as an example to help you understand some Photoshop basics. What I'm going to do first is drag in some other assets that I would like to add to this picture. So I have a boardwalk that I want to drag in. I'm going to just drag in the whole image like this. I have a water texture that I want to drag in. I want to add some water to this, this image. I have some background trees that I would like to use. I have this grassy field. I have a couple trees that I would like to use. This one has this like cutout trees badge attached to it. So I'm just going to use Control A to select all, and then I will use Alt and drag a window around this to deselect that part. Then I will grab my selection tool and just grab the tree. And I have another tree that I'm going to grab, and one more, which is a branch for the foreground. If we look at this canvas and we look over here to our layers palette, we see the background image here, and then we have all of these other textures in the file, and they just come in as random layer names. I wanted to make sure you understand the difference between selecting something using auto select and without auto select. So if we look up here to the top bar, you can see that this auto select is not turned on right now. So when I don't have auto select turned on, I can select any of these layers, and as I move it around, no matter where I click on the screen, that is the only layer that will be manipulated. So I can move around this background layer, I can grab the tree and I can move that around. I can grab the other layer and move that around. I can also select layers by right-clicking on them. For example, these background trees, I think that's layer 3. And I can move those around. If I change this to have auto select on, then Photoshop is basically going to extrapolate where my mouse is and what layer it's touching and automatically select that one. So if I am trying to get this water texture, I don't have to select anything on the screen here. I just have to grab onto it. If I grab onto these background trees instead, then those begin to move. If I grab onto this, this moves. You see how I'm not actually going and selecting it in the layers palette. I'm just clicking on it and Photoshop has automatically found it and detected it. Now that can be useful for some things, but what if we have a layer like that grass layer that I just moved behind these trees and I really want to find that grass layer, but it's hidden by something else. I would want to turn off my auto select and go into my layers palette here and find it, and then there it is. Now I can move it around. So if you find yourself confused by moving things around in Photoshop, just double check to see whether you have auto select on or not. That can make the difference in being able to select the things that you're looking to select. Right now, I'm just going to turn all of these off by turning off those eyes on the side here. And I'm going to focus on this foreground grasses layer. Now, I really like this picture, but I want to do some things to manipulate it. I would like to get rid of this sort of like burnt out plantain looking stuff here and just continue the sort of grassy meadow feel that's from this part of the image all the way to the foreground. I'd like to regularize some of these grasses and get rid of these little patches. And I also want to get rid of the background because I want to change it out for something different. So the first thing I'm going to do is put on a layer mask. A layer mask is like looks like a piece of paper that you've put over top of your image. So this is maybe a little bit difficult to understand right at the beginning, but as you work with layer masks, you're going to understand why they are so effective. Basically, what it allows us to do is remove or add parts of the image without actually changing the image itself. And this is what's known as non-destructive editing. We always want to work non-destructively because we never know when we might need to brush in some parts of the image back. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to use the polygonal lasso to just go into the background here and kind of roughly cut out this background. If I double click, it will just close the selection, and you can see I have this sky selected. Now, as long as I'm on my layer mask and my foreground color is white and my background color is black, you can always switch those by using this arrow or by pressing X. And I hit delete, then you can see that now it's gotten rid of the background, and now we just have a transparent background here. And I'm going to use the eraser tool. I've just hit the E button on my keyboard. I'm going to right click and select this eraser here. This is kind of one of the defaults, so if you're looking for that, you can find it in your general brushes up here. It's basically just a round brush that is 0% hard, which means it's very fuzzy on the edges. And I'm going to increase the size to somewhere around here. So I'm going to brush along the edge of this field just to soften up the edges in case I'd like to blend it into the background, which I probably will. But you notice that, you know, maybe you've deleted a little too much of the background. Maybe you want to bring some of it back in. I can use the brush tool, so B for brush, and right click, and I can find a brush. I'm going to look under mine. I have a whole bunch of grass brushes. If you've loaded up all the brushes from your assets, then you'll have access to these brushes as well. I'm going to select this one, and I'm just going to use it to brush in those background grasses in the back. So you can see now I can add in some kind of like grass looking edges to the background. And I could only do that because I'm working on a layer mask. If I had deleted that background information completely without using a layer mask, I wouldn't be able to go back in and brush in these layers. So now I can give it an edge, and if I zoom into 100%, you can see it looks more realistic to have grasses in an edge like this than it does to have it kind of like faded out as it did before. So I've used a brush to brush in part of the layer mask again, and I can go back and hit erase, and I'm using the left parentheses to lower the size of my brush, and I can just go back in and sort of refine this edge here so that it's not so sharp. And if I make a mistake and erase too much, what can I do? Just press my B, get back to my brush, and brush in that edge again, just the way I want it. So if I do Control 0, it will put the entire view back into my canvas. And now you can see we have a nice grassy edge in the background. So the next thing I'd like to do is manipulate these background trees. I'm going to zoom out, Control minus, and I'm going to name these background trees. And then I'm going to use Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal to just flip them over to the other side. And I'm going to use Control T to transform these. So I'm going to resize them just by grabbing the edge and dragging this down. It will automatically resize according to its existing ratio if you just use these corners to drag it up and down. If you wanted to resize it in one dimension, you could hold down Shift, and then you could, for example, stretch it like this or stretch it like that. But usually we don't want to distort images outside of their proportions. So I would just use the handles like this so that you're resizing them accordingly. I'm just going to kind of match the line of the horizon using my transform, rotate to move the corner edges down there. And then I'm going to just move it out to the background here. I want this layer to be behind the grasses. So I'm going to move this behind my foreground grasses. And automatically you can see where my grassy edge is. It looks a lot more natural. So it isn't a sharp transition between the cut edge of the grasses. It's nice and grassy. It looks more realistic. So I'm going to use transform to manipulate these trees a little bit more just to fit into my background. And I'll bring them over here. Now I want to change this edge of the trees because it's really straight and sharp, and that makes it obvious that it came from a texture that would have ended here. So I'm going to put a layer mask on my background trees, and I'm going to use my eraser. So press E for eraser, right click, and I'm going to find a brush that is kind of naturally shaped. I have one that looks like a tree. It's like this. And I'm just going to use this. I can right click and use this to rotate it. I'm just going to use this to kind of give this a more rough tree-like edge. So this is just a tree-shaped eraser. Your brushes and your erasers, they use the same shapes. So it's just a matter of whether you're erasing something in this shape or you're adding something in this shape. So that's fine. That looks more natural now. And already we have a completely different image. So let's keep going. I'm going to use this grass layer here to replace all of this section here. So I'm going to name this meadow grasses, and I'm going to bring it down over top of my foreground grasses. And I'm just going to move this with my selection tool and use Control T to transform it. I'm going to size it up like this. Normally we don't want to resize lower quality images up, but if I zoom into 100%, I think that this quality is still working fine for this image. So it's up to you to just kind of take a look and make sure that the quality of image you're using is of pretty much the same quality as the background image that you have. So again, I'm going to use a layer mask, and I'm going to use the lasso, L for lasso, and I'm going to make a rough selection along the edge of this grassy field. And select this. I'll double click to close the selection, and then I'll hit delete. You can see that the deleted part is gone from my layer mask. It shows up as black now. Control D to deselect. So I'm going to just lower the opacity here so I can see through and know where I need to erase the rest of the grasses. And I think what I would do is there's a couple ways you can get rid of it. As long as you're on the layer mask still, you could make a rough selection like this along the pathway, and you could get rid of the grasses that way. Or you could use the eraser. So I'm going to select just a regular eraser like this. I'm going to make the hardness a little bit less hard so that it's not a super hard edge on the end. And I can just use the eraser to kind of roughly erase those edges. I can use the parentheses tool on the right. It increases it. On the left, it decreases it. All right. So I've erased that. And I'm going to use the eraser tool again to sort of blend this side in. So I'm going to turn it all the way down to 0 for hardness, and that's going to make it more soft. And I'll increase the size so that it's a soft brush. And now I'm just going to kind of brush along the edges here. And you can see how that grass begins to like blend into the background on this side. So it doesn't look like a totally new texture over top of it. And I'll just put that back up to 100%. And I'm just erasing with my brush tool to sort of blend it into the background here. And now you can see this grass has blended pretty seamlessly with the other one. If I turn that off, I've just effectively covered up all of this stuff that I didn't want in the foreground, and that's pretty nice. All right, what else do I have in this file? Right, so let's say I want to replace this wooden path with something more formalized, like maybe this wood deck. So I think I put a few wood deck textures in your graphic assets. I don't know if I included this one, but this, is basically just looked up a boardwalk on Google and came up with this image. So I'm going to rename this boardwalk, put a layer mask on it, and I'm going to just select the part of the boardwalk that I want to use. So I'm going to go to about there, and I'm going to not include the shadow on this side because I don't want any of that edge. I just want the sort of board texture. So I've made a selection, and instead of selecting the part I'm going to delete, I've selected the part that I want to keep. So to delete all of this stuff out here, I can either do a right click and go select inverse, or I can just hit Shift Control I, which is a shortcut for select inverse. And now I can delete it and Control D to deselect. Now I have a texture, but it's facing the wrong direction. I want it to go around that way, not this way. So I'm going to use Edit, Transform Horizontal, and now it's kind of going off into the direction that I need it. It's not super perfect. So there's something that we can do to make that a little bit more adapted to this area. I'm going to use the Distort command. So I'll go to Edit, Transform, Distort. And I'm just going to drag on this handle here and drag it down. And you can see it kind of like moves the texture edge from the top down. And now it looks more like it's going off into the distance. Distort can kind of move an image around in different ways. For now, I'm just going to kind of distort it from the top and bottom so that it looks a little bit more flat and that it matches the picture plane that we're using here. So I'm moving it into place, and I'll hit Enter to accept the distortion. And once again, I'm going to just turn down the opacity here so I can kind of have something to target towards going off into the distance here. And I'm going to use my polygonal lasso to make a selection around the edge. And I'm just going to select all of the parts that I don't want in my image, and making sure I'm on my layer mask, I'm going to hit delete. And now those are gone. Control D to deselect, and I can turn this back up to 100. And now I have kind of a rough boardwalk going off into the distance. But I would really like this part to be something different. I think that I would like it to be a stream. So I'm going to use this texture of water to run over top of this middle part and go towards that dock. So I can just use this as is. I think I'm going to resize it a little bit just to make it fit the image a little bit better. And I will change the opacity so I can kind of see where it's going. So I think I want it around here. But there's kind of a problem, which is there's this big rock in the stream, and it's kind of messing up the scale of the stream. I'd like to get rid of that. So I'm going to use a tool called Content Aware Fill to eliminate that rock. So one of the things that we can do in Photoshop is use it to manipulate images to remove things that we don't want to see. So I'll use the polygonal lasso, and I'm just going to make a selection around this boulder like that. And then I'm going to go to Edit and Fill and make sure that this is on Content Aware. And I will hit OK. And Photoshop will use its artificial intelligence to sort of look around the image and fill in that part of the image with new information. So if I deselect, you can almost barely tell that there was a rock there before. It's done a really good job of blending in the colors and the textures and making it look almost seamless. There are a few other tools we can use to do this, but I think this is the easiest one right now. And now I'm going to just turn this opacity down again so I can kind of see through it. And again, I'm going to use a layer mask, use my polygonal lasso, and just make a selection over where I would like to keep the water. So I've selected the water. I'm going to select the inverse with Shift Control I, delete that part I don't want, Control D, and turn that back up to 100%. And now we have a bit of water here. It doesn't look super realistic yet, but we'll get there. So I'm going to just call this stream. Now, someone was asking in class today, why do we work on layer masks? Why don't we just get rid of all of the stuff we don't need? here's a really good example of why we don't do that. So first of all, if I want this stream to look a little bit transparent, I might want to turn down the opacity a little bit, but now the boards are going to show through. I could go back to my meadow grasses layer and I can brush in the rest of the grass textures over top of this wood to brush it back in. So I'm going to hit B for brush, and I'm going to make sure I'm on my layer mask. I will right click and I'm going to select a different type of grass brush. I'm just going to select this one over here. You can see it's as soon as I start brushing, it is immediately filling in that area. So I can still use my parentheses to increase the size of that brush. So I'm just going to increase it all the way. And here we go. I've filled in all of the area over top of that board with the grass layer. And now I can turn my stream back on. And what can I do here? I can erase the edges of my stream on the layer mask. I'll use E for erase. And I'm just going to kind of gently use a soft eraser to blend that into the edge. And then I'm going to change my eraser to one of those planting brushes again. So I'm going to go down to this one. This one is a great one. And I'm going to increase the size of it and just carefully use the eraser to brush in, erase out some of these grassy edges. You can see as we do that, that the stream looks more like it's running across this field over top of some rocks with some grasses kind of going over top of it. And I'll zoom in so you can see how that looks. So this edge up here is pretty unresolved. So I'm going to select the edge of the boards along one of the boards, like that. And I'm going to go onto my layer mask and just hit delete. And actually, I'm going to Control Z so that I get back to my selection. I will hit Shift Control I, which is inverse selection, and go onto this stream layer, grab an eraser by pressing E. Reduce the size, and now I can just erase the edge there. So now these are meeting a little bit more realistically. And here's something else you could do in Photoshop. So just using the polygonal lasso tool, you can make an edge, a thickness to this wood deck. So I've just made a selection along the top. I'm going to press Shift to constrain this to a vertical selection and go about down there. And then I will just finish off this rectangle over here. I'll make a new layer by pressing down this plus button. Then I'm going to go to Edit, Fill. And instead of Content Aware, I'm going to choose a color. And I'm just going to choose a color picking directly from this deck, but I'm going to make it a little bit darker, maybe down here like this. I'll hit OK, and now I have an edge of a deck. So I've zoomed out, and now we have this kind of deck floating, and there's a stream that kind of goes underneath it. This is not a realistic landscape, but it's just to kind of show you some of these compositing techniques. The last thing I'm going to do is add in some of these trees. So I have this tree, I have this tree, and I have a bunch of leaves in the corner. Let me deal with this one first. So I'm going to call this background tree. And the thing that we want to make sure we're paying attention to is the direction of light in the image. So if we look at this image in general, I would say that the light is highlighting these trees back here. It's kind of highlighting the grass on this side. It's highlighting this field of grass pretty evenly, but the shadows are definitely on the right-hand side of this image. So when we use assets, we want to just make sure that we're matching our lighting as closely as possible. So the shadows should be all on the same side. The highlights should be all on the same side. So I'll move this tree, and I'm going to use the Control-T transform command. I'm just zooming out to see everything on my screen. I'm going to rotate it a little bit and then just resize it down and hit Enter to accept that. And I'm going to put it somewhere back here. Now if I zoom in, it's nice to have a tree there, but it looks kind of weird just sitting here in this grass. Like if this was in real life, the grass would be covering up the roots. So what do? We add a layer mask, and then we hit erase, E for eraser, and we right click and we select, you can see your recently selected brushes here. I'm just gonna select this one, reduce it in size a little bit, and now I'm gonna erase using this grass to just make it look like it's embedded into this grassy field like that. Okay, so that's one of our background trees. I'm going to take this background tree and I'm going to move it. Again, I'm just going to analyze it quickly and say, okay, all of the light is on this side, all of the shade is on this side, so that makes sense with our view. I'm going to put it kind of more in the foreground, and then I'm going to use Control-T transform to just increase the size of this tree here, maybe rotate it a little bit so that it's upright. And I'm going to put it somewhere over here. Maybe I'll increase it just a little bit more. Trees like to be quite large, a lot larger than we envision them most of the time. Okay, so I'm going to put that tree here. And again, I don't want it to look like it's just floating in space. So I'm going to name it foreground tree. I'm going to put a layer mask on. I'm going to hit E for eraser, and it's already grabbed the grass eraser because that's what I was using before. And I'm going to use my right parentheses to increase the size of the brush. And then I'm just going to erase out this sort of grass pattern. So now it looks like it's actually sitting in the grass. So that's our foreground tree. And the last thing we have here are these leaves in the corner. So I want these to come from this corner, so I'm going to reverse the direction by going to Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal, and I'm going to put them in the corner here. And I'll resize them using Control-T Transform just to make it look as if there's a tree that's kind of right behind us that is shading over this area. So I'm going to just pop that up like that and pull it off the canvas a little bit so that it opens up. And one thing that we tend to do in landscape a lot is to give some motion to the leaves in the foreground. So as if there's like a breeze coming through, and we've just captured these leaves as they're kind of shaking in the wind. Some of these are already, if we zoom in to 100%, a little bit blurry. So I think this is like a really good candidate for making even more of a motion blur. So I'm going to hit Control-0 to set my canvas like that. And I'll call these foreground branch. And I am going to duplicate this. I'm going to duplicate it by pressing Control-J. So now I have two copies, and I'm going to call this one the sharp, and I'm going to call this one the blur. And I'll just turn off the sharp one for now. So making sure I'm on the foreground branch blur, I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, and then Motion Blur. So make sure you have preview checked off. You can see now a preview of how this blur affects that layer. And this little handle down here will direct the direction of the blur. So what I'm going to do is kind of make it a little bit more on an angle like this. I'm going to make the distance lower. So you can see it kind of gets less blurry the more I go. So maybe I'll do something in between. If it was really windy, maybe we would see it like super blurry, but I don't think normally we see it like that. I'm going to turn it down like this. So it's just it's a motion blur, but it's not like extreme motion blur. I'll hit OK. And then I have like a sharp layer and I have a blurry layer. And what I'm going to do is blend these together so that part of the branch is sharp and part of the branch is blurred, because usually when something is blurred, not the whole thing is blurred, just the edges are blurred, especially with leaves when they're shaking in the wind. So I'm going to put a layer mask here, and I am going to erase it in a different way. I'm not going to use E for eraser. I'm going to press G for gradient. So I'm going to hit G on my keyboard, And you see that brings up this little dialog box up here that shows you kind of like a preview of a gradient. And what I'm going to do is just switch my foreground and background colors here so that black is in the foreground. And now you see this switches to a black gradient like this. Whenever we're on black, it means we're erasing something. So I'm going to click and drag in this direction, the direction of my motion blur. And as I click and drag, I can do it multiple times. You can see that I've created an erased area that is in a gradient. Now I actually have mine on radial gradient right now. I'm just going to Control Z to undo that and go to linear gradient. And I'm going to click and drag again. And now as I click and drag, you can see that the entire area back here is all erased and it's just kind of fading into the sharp leaves. So that's that layer. I'm going to do the same thing with this one, but in reverse. So I'm going to put a layer mask on it, and I'm going to just zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to drag my gradient from this direction. So now from this direction, we have a blurry layer that is full opacity at the edges. And in this direction, we have a sharp layer that's full opacity at the corner. And if we put them together, we have a branch that is more still here and more blurred here. Obviously, the last thing we need for this image is a sky. So one thing that's like a really easy thing to do is you can always drag in a sky image if you want. There's plenty of those in your graphic assets. If you go into Photoshop and then skies, I have way more than you, but you have a whole bunch of options. You could always just drag one of these in and kind of resize it. Another way to do a sky is just to add a layer and then drag it to the very bottom so it's underneath everything else. I'm going to name mine sky. And I'm going to do a gradient here as well. So I'm going to hit G for gradient. And when I'm not on a layer mask, you can see that the actual color of whatever color I have selected is showing. So I'm going to hit that and go here to kind of a blue like this. And I'm going to go into this, I'm going to use this drop down to look at the basics. So we have a few options here. One is color to background, and that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to just hit that. Then I'm going to go to my background and click on this kind of yellowy layer here. So now I have a gradient that's going to go from blue to yellow, which is kind of how the sky goes on a late afternoon. And I'm just going to start my gradient up here and drag it down to kind of the middle of the page. And I can move the gradient around. So if I want to move it so it's a little bit more hazy and yellow in the background, I can do that. If I want to transform it, I can hold down Shift and just drag this top edge down so that the blue gradient is a little bit more intense. Use something like that. And you can see, like in a half hour, we've composited 10 layers. We've done some atmospheric effects with blurring. We've added in trees. We know how to blend things using brushes and erasers. And this is like, not the most convincing realistic thing that you've ever seen in the world, but it's a pretty good start towards how you can begin compositing images together.